Coalition season is here. Coalition talks are well underway. The nation is gripped with hope and anxiety. Let's take a walk through exactly what has happened since the declaration of the election results and our last get together on this channel, and unpack all the coalition dynamics and the scenarios so that you are in a position to have a full appreciation of South African politics. Let's go. Spread the fire. Welcome back to South Africa's fastest growing current affairs independent digital media platform, SMWX. It stands for the Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh Xperience. That's me if you're new around here. And on this channel, we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. Thank you for taking us past 100,000 subscribers, 110 now, actually. It's amazing how this channel is growing. Before we get started, I just want to really thank you all for building this into such a influential platform over the last election and over the last week. And it's really wonderful to see all the comments, and we feel it. And I'm so glad that you're enjoying the analysis. Now, in today's episode, I want to discuss a couple of things. First, I want to just talk about where we are in the process of this election and the formation of a government. Just give you a sense of taking a step back and figuring out where we are and indeed where we're going. Then I want to take another deep look, because a few days have passed, which is a long time in politics, at the various coalition options. I think we've seen a shifting in public sentiment around that, and look at some of the options that are currently on the table. Having done that, I want to talk about considerations for a future government. Because as much as we talk about the composition of that government, we also need to start prioritizing what that government actually does. And then having done that, I want to look at the upcoming and impending parliamentary sitting to elect a president and a speaker and a deputy speaker, if we ever get there, because you never know what could happen in this wonderful country of ours. So that's the roadmap for today. However, in my fervor to start the last episode, I forgot to discuss a very crucial issue, and this is the question of Oratile's beard. Now, I just want the true members of the channel will know what we're talking about here. I had a bet with my producer that the ANC would fall below 50. I said they would fall below 50. He said there was no way they would fall below 50. And the one who lost the bet would have to shave their beard. As you see, I sit before you with the full beard. Now, in mercy towards Oratile, we have decided not to bring him in front of the camera and show you his newly shaven face. But I can assure you that the beard was shaved. And go onto my Twitter timeline, because there's a video of him actually shaving his beard if you want to see that. So shout out to all the SMWX family who wanted to know what happened with the beard. Okay, now that we've dealt with that issue of national importance, let's get back to less important issues like the direction of the country. So where are we? Many things need to be said here, and I don't think we've even fully digested these election results yet. So I just want to pay attention to a few of the results that I think people are missing because of their significance. The first thing to say is actually that the ANC fell below 40 in this election. When you combine the national ballot and the regional ballot, which is now the new total which determines parliamentary seats, the ANC is actually at 39.77%. This means that in this election, they fell from the high 50s, not to the high 40s, but to the high 30s. And I'm seeing a lot of inaccurate analysis where people say the ANC is at 41 or 40. Actually, to be accurate, they're at 39.77 or just below 40. So they didn't hit that 40 mark. And again, I think that is dramatic. So I think we all kind of saw the results, but we haven't actually looked closely at what the final results truly are. And the ANC fell below 40 people. Now, I don't think a lot of people saw that coming. I certainly didn't. I thought they would be below 45 for sure. But below 40 is just unprecedented. So that's the first thing. The other thing I had a very close look at looking at these elections was the city results. So even though this isn't a local government election, I always like to have a look at results in places like Joburg, in places like eThekwini, in places like Nelson Mandela Bay, because that can give you a little inkling as to what might happen in the next election. So I'm already thinking about 2026 dynamics, because remember that election is 2 years away. And I did exactly the same thing when I got pretty close to predicting the outcome of this election by looking at the previous local government election. So what do we find when we look at the cities? And maybe this can be a whole episode in future. The ANC is in danger in 2026, if this trend continues, of losing every single one of the metros. Every single one. Now, Polokwane may look the safest, and Mbombela also looks relatively safe, but these are all up for grabs. Nelson Mandela Bay, even Buffalo City, obviously Cape Town, Joburg, Ekurhuleni, Tshwane, eThekwini is gone. So we sit in Mangaung is gone if we look at the current results, or very close to being gone. So what this election means is not just that the ANC has lost national power, not just that it's lost now 4 provinces outright, but also that it stands on the precipice, if it does not get its act together, of losing all, if not a majority, and a big majority, of control over the metros that it already hasn't lost, and falling even further behind in the ones that it has lost. So I think that's a massive sign and a signal that should be causing panic in ANC ranks, because the question now is not what they do with this coalition. That's short-term thinking. The question is, what coalition can get them back on track for 2026 so that they don't lose all the metros? Now, there are a few other things I just want to talk about in terms of where we are. Let's talk about the coalition conversations. I think we're really at a place now where the parties are still negotiating among themselves. So the ANC, the DA, the EFF are still negotiating internally, MK, etc. So be careful what you believe, be careful what gets leaked, because it could be factions within these parties leaking things so that they gain an advantage at the internal negotiating table. In fact, as I speak, the ANC NEC meeting is about to kick off. DA internal meetings are ongoing, EFF internal meetings are ongoing, and MK internal meetings are ongoing. So where we are right now is we're at, I would say, stage 1. Actually, sorry to use stages. I know it causes anxiety in South Africa because stage 1 often means something else. Okay, let me say phase 1. Phase 1 is where the parties themselves are going to try and figure out what's happening. And I expect phase 1 to last about until the weekend or early next week. Right. Phase 2, which will be next week, if you thought this week was fun, just wait for next week. Phase 2 will be once the parties have set their priorities and ranked their preferences in terms of an outcome, they will then enter the negotiating table. And that is where plans will have to meet with reality. And parties will have to ascertain whether what they thought the other party would give up is actually what they're going to give up. So we're still very early in the game. Even if the ANC says, oh, our best option is X, right? That doesn't mean that it's going to survive the negotiations next week. And likewise for DA, EFF, MK. So IFP as well, which is an increasingly important player. And I might also add the Patriotic Alliance, which is a very important player as well. So where we are right now, just to give you a sense, is that parties are still figuring themselves out. And I think after they've figured themselves out, weekend to early next week, they're going to have to figure out how they talk to each other. So I'd expect clarity late weekend, early next week. But because of the complexity of these negotiations, you can't rule out a scenario in which those negotiations just simply don't reach fruition before the deadline of the parliamentary sitting, which is likely to be somewhere around the 18th of June. It needs to be 14 days after the declaration. So we're on a 14-day clock, and parties, the clock will run out somewhere kind of late mid-June. And if there are no conclusions to negotiations, which is a possible scenario, then there will be further anxiety and uncertainty. Now, just to give you a roadmap of where we are. So phase 1 of negotiations is parties figuring out what they want. Phase 2 is parties negotiating with each other. Phase 3 is the parliamentary sitting. And once again, there's actually no guarantee that the members of parliament in that parliamentary sitting are faithful to what their party tells them to do. And that is a fascinating prospect. Because remember, voting for president is done via secret ballot. So we can't also rule out the prospect that there could be a breaking of ranks, either within the ANC or within the DA or within EFF or MK, in which case all those negotiations might be for naught, because there could be secret negotiations behind the formal negotiations. And we know that former President Jacob Zuma is a master of the secret negotiation and of underground political strategy. So just because there are no formal negotiations between the ANC and MK does not mean that there are not underground negotiations between at least some elements of the ANC and MK. In a nutshell, strap in your seatbelt, because that parliamentary sitting could get interesting. So we know after around about the June 16th long weekend, we're going to have that parliamentary sitting. And then, technically, all that needs to happen at that sitting is that we elect a president. That sitting will not elect a cabinet, for example, because that's actually within the power of the president to do. So what I would foresee, let's assume that we get a president on that first parliamentary sitting and there's no chaos. If there's chaos and there's drama, then, well, we might have a different president to what we expect, or the sitting will collapse or something like that. But let's assume we do get a president. What will happen after that is that that president will then constitutionally have the power to form a cabinet. And I would expect that negotiation process to actually be quite long, because I don't think the parties are going to fully finish the negotiation in time. They might agree on a president, and then once the president is in place, they will have further negotiations around the cabinet and various, because remember, you're actually negotiating the entire state here. It's not just cabinet, it's also DG positions, it's ambassadors, it's the people in state-owned enterprises, on the boards of public companies. And the negotiation could actually involve every sphere of government. So you're doing that across 3 spheres of government in 2 weeks. It's virtually impossible, actually. So we could have a president. In fact, we will. I would put it to you. We'll have a president and not a cabinet very soon after we have a president. Even when the ANC had a majority in 2019, for example, right? It still took Cyril Ramaphosa a week to announce his cabinet. So I think he was elected on the 22nd of May, if I'm not mistaken, 2019. He only announced his cabinet on the 29th. And those of you who have vivid memories will recall that that was because even just the ANC negotiations about who should be in cabinet and who shouldn't took a really long time to figure out. So imagine trying to negotiate with 3, 4, 5 different parties, right? So I would suggest that the quickest we will have a new cabinet is probably by roughly around the end of June. So this is going to be a month of uncertainty, of wrangling, of negotiations, and probably in the best case scenario, in my view, only towards the end of this month would we actually have a president and a cabinet, and then July forward would be the start of the new government in earnest. In the worst case scenario, of course, there are all kinds of constitutional anomalies which could result in the collapsing of the first sitting. And if that collapse happens and there is no time to meet the 14-day window, then we go into a constitutional limbo because we have missed a constitutional deadline and there's no president. And, well, all I can say is there will be lots of episodes of SMWX if that happens. By the way, I'm sorry to say, I think SMWX is like one of the few entities that is actually benefiting from all of this. Like the only people benefiting right now are those of us who are giving you content about this crazy, crazy period. So I'm not saying I want it to carry on, but hey, you know, it's a good time for SMWX, if no one else. Cool. So that's just where we are. And I'm just trying to give you a picture of where we are, where we're going. So you don't expect things to happen overnight. And you also don't expect things to take like 7 years. Please no. That's roughly the best case timeline. Okay, so having said that, I want to take another look at some of these coalition options because I think we've seen a shift in public sentiment and a shift away from what looks likely, especially from an ANC-DA coalition. Who knows, it could still happen, but I think we've seen a backlash to that idea, which I suggested is exactly what would happen. So I want to talk about the ANC-DA coalition. I want to talk about this new proposal of a government of national unity. And then I want to talk about some other possible proposals which we shouldn't rule out at all. Hey fam, I interrupt this episode because as you know, there's a crew behind SMWX, a passionate, talented, and brilliant crew that helps to bring you these episodes. And I want to return some of the love back to that crew who have just produced a movie, a psychological thriller called Face Deep. We're going to show you the trailer of that movie, and I would encourage you, if you're a fan of SMWX, to show some love to the crew, show some love to that movie, go and check it out where you can. If you're watching this after it's been released in cinemas, still go and try to check it out wherever you can. If you're watching this week that we're releasing it in, on Saturday the 8th of June, you can also check out the director of Vuyani Bila, who will be at a special screening at Sterland Pretoria at 3:30 on that Saturday p.m. and New Metro Menlyn at 7:45 p.m. Art's Sake is the production crew that puts all this together, so also check out Art's Sake Productions on social media for more information about this video. Let's repay the love, have a check out of this trailer, and then we'll get back to the episode. This is Face Deep.
I'm just soaking it all in.
What would it be that you're soaking in?
Lerato, bophelo.
Life would be meaningless.
No one says no to me, baby. No one. An orphan girl seeking marriage from an old man. It sounds very romantic.
And there's a new woman in the house.
Does this mean you and I are never gonna get married?
The next moment you hear, the next day you're sick. And it's Carlo Bakwalibadimu.
How am I supposed to call someone that gives you the wrong pills, the wrong dosage, deliberately, when you are back in full strength? We need to get that bitch out of this house.
I'm gonna take my husband away. Kamo, I am the queen. What are you doing? I'm calling the cops. You think I'm gonna let my father stay in this madhouse? Hello?
It's clear that an ANC-DA coalition will be an extremely divisive political project. And those who think it will bring stability should reconsider their position. As I said in the previous video, it may bring parliamentary majorities, but do not confuse a parliamentary majority with either political or social or indeed economic stability. And that seems to be the chief virtue of this ANC-DA alliance in people's eyes. It will create, quote, stability. They don't say it will create economic growth. They don't say it will necessarily improve governance. They don't say that it will create social justice. It will cause, quote, stability. Now, if it doesn't cause stability, then it's hard to see what the virtues of this agreement would be. So before I come to what I think the true virtues would be, I have to caution people against rushing towards this option. And it's amazing how many people have, in the opening days, rushed towards this option. I saw former Wits Vice Chancellor Professor Adam Habib saying that this would be the sensible option. I disagree fundamentally, and I think that's misguided. The same people were telling us that Cyril Ramaphosa would bring us a new dawn, and their predictions fell woefully short of reality. We have people like Justice Malala in a column saying that this would prevent, economic oblivion kind of thing. And the editor of News 24, Adrian Basson, is quarter to chaining himself to the Naspers tower to make sure that the ANC-DA coalition becomes a reality. He's willing to lay down his life for this thing to happen. Now, the key rhetorical move in trying to bring this together is to paint any other scenario, and this has been the DA's message, which now seems to be being swallowed up by various observers and commentators uncritically, is that any other scenario would be catastrophic for South Africa. So it's an attempt to say the only option which would avoid catastrophe is the option that happens to help the ANC and the DA. And I would say particularly the DA more than the ANC. Fact of the matter is that's just not true. South Africa has many ways of avoiding catastrophe. And in fact, I think the idea of an economic catastrophe is one of the remotest prospects in this entire process. We must avoid, and I think it's actually quite irresponsible for people to try and stoke fear of some kind of impending catastrophe when we're in this delicate situation. South Africa has survived many things. I don't often agree with Gayton McKenzie, but on this one, I have to agree with him. I saw him saying the Rand, quote unquote, survived apartheid, but it can't survive this coalition era. No. Don't allow people to make you think that there's some kind of impending economic catastrophe that's 1 week away. Are there economic risks? Yes, there are economic risks, but those risks need to be measured in a clear-eyed way. And I think that various alternatives to the ANC-DA coalition would also present opportunities for economic stability, at least to the extent that an ANC-DA coalition would. What do people really mean by stability as well? Because once again, stability in financial markets also does not equate to economic stability. So it seems that, number one, stability is being equated to economic stability, and then in turn, economic stability is being equated to financial market stability. An economy, from someone who studied economics, by the way, all the way to honors, is much more than simply its financial markets and its speculative markets. An economy is about the real economy as well. And it's also about questions like unemployment, questions like inequality, questions like poverty, and the lived experience of people. So to simply collapse the economy into speculation markets is just inaccurate. So I'm not convinced, number one, that any option except ANC-DA creates this economic collapse. Now, even the so-called, quote, worst case scenario of an ANC-MK-EFF alliance, I'm not convinced causes a short-term economic collapse, let alone a long-term one. When you actually look at financial market analysts and how they would price that scenario, yes, the Rand probably will take a short-term hit. It's impossible to predict what would happen after that. By the way, I remember attending this economics lecture where there was this PhD trying to explain how political factors influence currencies. And it's a very complex process. It's not as simple as saying 1 + 1 there equals 2. So we also can't predict the long-term direction of the market. But I would say in terms at least of the currency market, which is only one of many different markets, I'm not so sure that the price of even the worst case scenario is catastrophe, a la some kind of massive market crash or all that kind of doomsaying. It's probably a much different rand, maybe a 10%, 20% swing in the rand, which sure would have economic consequences, particularly on the price of imports, probably help some of our exporters, by the way. There are certain economists who think that the rand should depreciate for the overall well-being of the economy. But even then, I don't want people to make these lazy arguments that anything other than the ANC or the DA is going to create a market collapse. The South African economy is quite a robust institution. We've got extremely developed financial markets. Yes, political instability or uncertainty can affect the value of the currency in the short term. But even then, if a government takes steps to ameliorate those shocks, then an absolute market collapse can and will, in my view, be avoided. So I just want to dispel this myth that anything other than the ANC-DA equals market collapse, i.e. financial market collapse. What other markets could be being spoken about? Are we talking about equity markets and people's savings? Are we talking about capital markets? Are we talking about the market for foreign direct investment? All of those markets, I think, are ultimately contingent on real hardcore economic policy and policy gains in the long term. So any government is going to be judged in the long term by the market, depending on how it delivers to the South African people. And I might add that Cyril Ramaphosa's last 5 years have not been good for the value of the rand. I think he came in at a rand to the dollar around 13, 14, and it's now, as he ends his term, closer to 19. So we've already had a serious depreciation in the rand. So I think we need a more sophisticated conversation about how capital, equity, currency markets would price alternatives to an ANC-DA coalition. And I think we've seen that in some of the newer, less hysterical commentary. Now, having said that, what are the political risks of such a coalition, right? And I think this has become clear. I think there are risks to the DA. And I think there will be people internally in the DA, those who are clear-eyed, who are able to see these risks. There are also risks to the ANC. And let's take a look at how that has unfolded. Start with the ANC. You've seen a big internal backlash within the party against this idea because of the ideological differences between the ANC and the DA. The ANC has struggled with unity since Polokwane. A deal with the DA would turbocharge internal divisions. You would see breakaways, you would see splits. What have we already seen? Senior figures like Lindiwe Sisulu coming out publicly to say how dare we consider this option. People and institutions like COSATU and the SACP virtually saying that this would threaten the alliance, right? So I think what's clear is that at least some form of breakaway or boycott or protest against an ANC-DA pact would come from within the ANC. And it's not clear to me how that creates stability. Within the DA, I think certain strategists have begun to see that any deal with the DA, any deal with the ANC from the DA side amounts to handing the ANC back a certain amount of power. And for a party that has criticized the ANC and its form of governance and cadre deployment and corruption for 30 years, for a party like that to give power back to the ANC is going to be a very delicate thing to sell to the electorate. It may be easy now, but once the gloss has worn off and we're into the trenches of governance and service delivery, and the ANC starts making mistakes and unemployment is still high and growth is not ticking up, the DA will bear a certain amount of the burden of that and won't be able to turn around and play its role as opposition, even if there's a confidence and supply agreement. Everyone will know that the DA has helped the ANC to get back into power. So it's not clear whether such a deal is good for the ANC. It's not clear whether such a deal is actually in the long term good for the DA either. Here's the third danger of the ANC-DA coalition and why it doesn't necessarily create, quote, stability. the quickest way to make the MK party and Jacob Zuma and Julius Malema and the EFF infinitely more powerful is to go for an ANC-DA coalition. They will ride the wave of backlash to the point where that political movement, no matter what the configuration of it, that segment of the electorate will become an extremely loud opposition voice, an extremely loud opposition voice in parliament. Let's just stop there for all those who talk about political stability. Look at how disruptive and disrupted parliament has become just with the EFF, right? From 44 seats, and actually from 25 seats before that, the EFF has been able to completely change the culture of parliament, and in many ways, if not change the direction of ANC decisions, rarely cause the ANC big headaches with 44 seats, right? So you're telling me an ANC-DA coalition in which there is an MK at 58 seats and an EFF at 38 seats. So basically close to a third of parliament, capable of disrupting parliament. You're telling me that's going to be stable? Get out of here. These people telling you about, be very careful what analysts you listen to. And if they predicted that Cyril Ramaphosa's New Dawn was going to succeed, you probably shouldn't listen to them ever again. That won't necessarily be stable, and you're going to give Jacob Zuma and Julius Malema the political gift of an ANC-DA coalition. Just wait to see what they do with that. Picture the scene. As soon as the first crisis emerges, because every government deals with the crisis, or as soon as the first policy decision is taken which is unpopular, Julius Malema ascends to the stage, his supporters energetic, talks about how this is a sellout, talks about how this is apartheid 2.0, talks about how the ANC government and the DA are no different and that a new direction needs to be charted, talks about how social justice is no longer on the agenda, and unless people get together to remove this government, there will be reversals in the small gains that have been made since freedom. Former President Zuma is doing exactly the same thing with MK. EFF and MK are now starting to find each other because they agree against this. They've got a common enemy now, and they are just causing big upheaval politically, let alone socially, right? If that's stability, then by all means, have your stability. But those people who only see stability through the narrow lens of financial markets are going to have another thing coming because they can't understand political and social stability. Having said that, there are no perfect options, by the way, and we can talk until the cows come home, and I have in the last video about the threats of all these options. But I'm afraid it's my duty to cut against media narratives that are just wildly and outlandishly inaccurate. Right? So this idea that stability is on the way, I just don't think there are any really very stable options, and we're going to have to go through a certain period of political stability until things settle. Okay, so that's the ANC-DA coalition, and I think we're seeing that no longer be the top option, although things can change very quickly in negotiations. What would be the virtues of that? Well, it depends exactly what they do with it, but what I would like to see if such an eventuality occurred is, sure, you would get accountability to the extent that various ANC people would lose a lot of power, right? We already see 70 MPs, people like Gubudile Dyanti, who was lording over the public protector's impeachment inquiry, gone, right? Or at least not on the list. We'll see what happens later. Someone like Naledi Pandor, who I think has been one of the most impressive politicians over the last 5 years, and a brilliant foreign minister, not just by South African, but by global standards, hasn't made the list. Begi Cele. So an ANC-DA coalition, like any other coalition, could actually do well to unplug, quote unquote, the ANC from more power, which I think would be a good thing. I think the ANC needs to feel power slipping in some sense. So clearly you could see certain ministries that would be taken away from the ANC, And that could also open a window for greater accountability. We've seen former minister Zizi Kodwa now before courts. We'll probably see more people before courts, and the ANC won't be able to just keep them in place. If they have a partner in the DA will be very, very keen to make sure that state capture and corruption cases are taken seriously, and they'll put pressure on the ANC to act decisively. So I think from the accountability perspective, it could be interesting. And I think that also applies to other potential coalitions. Look, the DA has governance experience in a serious place like the Western Cape for a long time. And so there's no doubt that in terms of all the other political parties, the DA has the most governance experience. And if they're able to use that wisely and do a deal with the ANC where governance and the basics of governance that everyone agrees on, water, sanitation, electricity, roads, infrastructure, service delivery at its heart, if the DA is able to secure those kind of basics, right, so that we have 5 years where there's no load shedding, so that we can actually see tangible gains in water provision, in infrastructure development, in budgets. Right? The DA knows how to run a budget, at least in the Western Cape, right? So if we see further budgetary improvements while still maintaining social spending, I think that is an interesting proposition, and that will create a window for South Africa to move out from. That's not necessarily the same as stability and prosperity, but it would be an improvement in governance. So that's how I see the upside of a potential ANC-DA coalition. Okay, let's talk about this new idea that is emerging from the ANC, which is a government of national unity. Now, it seems that the ANC has listened to the backlash against the ANC-DA coalition and is now trying to consider something of a government of national unity where it brings everyone around the table and we all sing Kumbaya. Right? It's a very President Ramaphosa thing to do, right? He always talks about building consensus. He was a key player in CODESA and the parliamentary negotiations which led to our constitution. And in some ways, President Ramaphosa is at his best when he's bringing people to the table across the aisle and trying to find that consensus. So I can see why he would be interested in this option. However, the difficult part of a government of national unity is what happens with the ANC, the EFF, and the DA. So would this government of national unity involve especially the DA and the EFF, right? Because that would cause difficulties for the coherence of such a government, right? It's clear that the DA has demonized the EFF. It's clear that the EFF has demonized the DA. That's been part of this election, the way that even opposition parties have been at loggerheads. So how would a government of national unity keep those two sides, those two extremes of South African politics and ideology coherent in such a way that neither of those two sides would actually fear an electoral loss after this, right? Because the danger of a government of national unity to opposition parties is that the ANC swallows them up, that the ANC takes credit for bringing everyone together. To the extent that that government has any successes, the ANC takes credit for those successes first and foremost. And then the other opposition parties are in a difficult position because even national gains could result in electoral losses. So I'm interested to see, and I'm not so sure that this government of national unity idea will survive the negotiating table because parties are going to start making those calculations. Now, it might, because the virtue of it is that no one becomes the biggest loser. So everyone gains something. And every party can actually have a chance to show what they can do. So, for example, if the DA gets some ministries there, they'll be very eager to show what they can do at a national level. Same for the EFF and the IFP and the PA, etc. However, a government of national unity is going to be more complex to negotiate than a 2 or 3 party coalition. And so it also would potentially give leverage to the smaller players in that government of national unity who can threaten to leave. And if they leave, that creates reputational damage to the government of national unity. we actually have history of a government of national unity after 1994. That was the first government that we ever had. But people must remember that that government of national unity was very different. The ANC had 65% of the vote at the time, right? So they were in an unassailable electoral position and they were not in danger of the government collapsing. And even in that position, the government of national unity only lasted until 1996 when members of the National Party withdrew from the government. And why did they withdraw? Well, they withdrew because they saw that it was leading to massive electoral and political reversals for the National Party, which ultimately dissolved because it couldn't withstand all the credit would go to the ANC and they would get all the blame. By the way, they deserved all the blame for all that they did to South Africa, but that's neither here nor there. So a government of national unity, even if it is formed, I'm not so sure how long it lasts, certainly in its original state. And I think I give it a maximum of 2 years before you see cracks really start to emerge. So that leaves another alternative, which is, well, there are two, I would say there are two variants of this alternative, maybe three, which is that the ANC goes with left-leaning partners. The one version of that, which I want to consider, which I haven't seen considered much, is actually doesn't involve MK. It's ANC EFF plus one. So IFP, UDM ATM, plus Patriotic Alliance, maybe. So this is interesting because this avoids the uncertainties that some people have over MK. You can give MK the peace offering of governing KZN, which they seem set to do anyway. And by the way, it looks like the IFP and MK are finding themselves in KZN. And I just want to give a shout out to Nkosi Hlabisa right now because he looks like one of the adults in the room. He's been on this channel. Check out my interview with him. But he seems to be taking a very mature approach to this and also prioritizing peace in KwaZulu-Natal, which is a really important imperative. So what you could have is that MK is running KZN with the IFP, but on a national level, let's say the EFF, IFP, and ANC are in a governing coalition. By the way, if I'm the DA, I like this option. I like this option a lot because I continue to govern the Western Cape, but just like I said, the ANC and the EFF and MK would be a political gift to them. This could be a gift to the DA. Because anytime this government makes a mistake, anytime there's a crisis, the DA can swoop in. They're not part of government and they can say, we are the alternative to this, right? So in some ways, I think the DA may be happy. They are at home in opposition benches, and this would give them an opportunity to really create a contrast between this new ANC, EFF, IFP government, right? So I think this option needs to be considered further. I do not see any kind of market slide or collapse if this happens. Maybe a short-term shock, but I think that the price of that can be absorbed by the economy, and it would be up to the government then, that kind of government, to reassure markets to the extent that they do matter, and to reassure, most importantly, the people. Here's the thing about any coalition combination, right? We are past the point where you can spin your way into electoral majorities. No matter what coalition is formed, if that government does not deliver basic services, if that government does not turn the economy around, if that government does not deliver on social justice, if that government does not deliver on water, on sanitation, on roads, they're going to get obliterated politically. So if I'm in the EFF and I'm saying, let's go into this government better deliver. This government better deliver. And believe me, you will see me in a government like that. I'm not going to be just a praise singer for any government. I'm going to be very critical of any government, ANC, EFF, DA, MK, because that's what people need from the media landscape. In the New Dawn era, it looked like a lot of the media just rolled over and became the PR wing of the Ramaphosa political movement, right? So an EFF, IFP, ANC government would probably lean marginally to the left. If it doesn't deliver, it's going to be terrible for the EFF electorally, terrible for the ANC electorally, and the IFP will also probably take some hits electorally. So whatever coalition, ANC-DA, EFF, MK, unless there are very quick and obvious government improvements, they're in for a really bumpy ride. Another variant of that would be ANC-MK or ANC-EFF-MK. The reason why I think this is probably looking less likely is because of the MK demand around President Cyril Ramaphosa, but demands are very flexible in election negotiations, even in the apparently most inflexible scenario. There, I think there would be a lot more uncertainty, political, social, and indeed economic. And that's why I think this option is it's popular. Don't make any mistake about that. It would nearly have 2/3 majority legitimacy. And people want that. People want a very quick turnaround. They want a government which is focused on justice and questions of historical inequality. But there would be a lot of political noise and hysteria. And the media would drive the market, and the market would drive the media, and they would have a big task on their hands just in the short term to stabilize things and reassure the country. And I'm not sure that any of those parties want to go down that rocky road, but maybe that becomes the option. So I've given you some tools to think about where we are, the different coalition options, and also tried to cut against some of the more mainstream narratives about these coalition options to ascertain what eventualities could arise. And of course, as the weeks unfold, we'll look at how these negotiations are going and what other options are emerging, because they're sure to emerge. Okay, I want to look very quickly now at some considerations for a future government. Now, a future government, and I saw a really brilliant point. There hasn't been a lot of great analysis on mainstream media, sadly, of all of this. I'm sure you're all as tired of it as I am. But the associate professor at UJ, head of Department of Politics and IR, I think, if he's still head of department, Baso Ndenze, great thinker in international relations, made a really brilliant point that a lot of people haven't considered. People are currently assuming that coalition negotiations are going to be compromises around policies that we currently know, right? NHI, BEE, foreign policy, etc. The thing that a coalition government has to be able to do is not just withstand the controversies that we already know about. A coalition government has to withstand future crises. And no one can predict what that future crisis will be. And those future crises are largely likely to determine the coalition government more than the current crises that we already see, right? Think about the last 5 years. The COVID crisis. Imagine that was a coalition government. The Russia-Ukraine war. No one could have foreseen that in advance. The Israel-Palestine-Gaza genocide question and debate. No one could have foreseen that in advance, right? So what are the future crises? And would a coalition government be able to withstand that? And this is why, again, I'm a little concerned about an ANC-DA coalition and how stable that would be, because it's all well and good to negotiate on the basis of what we know, but what happens if there's an international crisis? Another new one, right? One that involves East and West. What happens if Taiwan pops off, right? And there's a serious crisis where US-China tensions escalate. Would a DA-ANC coalition withstand that? Because I suspect they might be on opposite sides of such a crisis, where the ANC would be a little more neutral, quote unquote, non-aligned, whereas the DA would certainly be very pro-US on such a crisis, right? So that could split the government. So we need to think about which government would be more robust for future crises in addition to the existing crises, right? So I thought that was an astute observation. Here's going to be one of the biggest spanners in the works of any coalition. Who is the president of the country? Now, I know the popular and the quick answer to that is Cyril Ramaphosa, right? A few problems with that. They don't emerge immediately now in the short term, but they become longer term problems. The first is that the ANC is wounded, and Ramaphosa has taken them from 57 to 39.7, right? So the ANC would be endorsing a president who has failed electorally. And setting that precedent would mean that future leaders of the ANC would be able to survive if they suffer resounding electoral defeats. Ramaphosa is a compromise candidate now because he's acceptable to some extent on the left and on the right. However, his Achilles heel is Phala. And I think Phala is a future crisis, one of those future crises, that is going to be very difficult for any coalition to negotiate. Why do I say that? Any coalition partner, whether it's the EFF or the DA or MK, is going to have to reckon with Phala. We've seen recently that the Concourt is going to consider the EFF's application to ask Parliament to relook at the report of Justice Ngobo, which said that Parliament should investigate Phala, possibly with the consequence of impeachment, right? Whatever happens with that case, and that's going to be a big thing for the new government to deal with. It's going to happen around August, September, I think, the hearing will be. Already, that's a big crisis, right? Because you have a president, the Concourt is now hearing a case about whether there should be an impeachment inquiry about that president. Even if the EFF loses that case, there's already a cloud around the president, right? There's nothing that stops Parliament in its new configuration from just bringing that question to Parliament again, right? And saying, hey, we want an ad hoc committee to look at this. The Freedom Front Plus has said they're going to do that, right? So let's take a look at ANC-DA. If there's an ANC-DA coalition, what happens when EFF and MK forcefully raise Phala, right? The president is in a very weak position, but his coalition partner is now in a dilemma. Do they back him? In which case, so much for the DA's talk about corruption, right? You're defending cash in a couch now. Or do they sacrifice him? In which case, now the decision to back him looks unwise, right? Or do they try to muddle through, in which case there's just this constant cloud over the president and questions of law enforcement are, will be asked. There's no way around this Phala thing. A president who has cash in his couch in US dollars, mysteriously found and stolen from his farm, is a crisis that needs to be explained, and until it's explained, it will always be lurking in the political background. Right? Same for EFF or MK. If they go into coalition with the ANC and the DA raises Phala, what will they do? Because they'll look weak if suddenly they are now prevaricating and defending the president on Phala, right? So every coalition negotiator, if they want my advice, needs to think very carefully about this issue, because I think it could be one of the first crises that confronts the government. And they need to think carefully about where they position themselves in relation to that crisis and whether President Ramaphosa is in fact the ideal candidate that he looks like right now. Problem that the ANC and other partners have is that the same applies to other potential presidential candidates from the ANC, right? Paul Mashatile, same dilemma applies. Gwede Mantashe, state capture report, a similar dilemma applies. So maybe the ANC needs to get creative and think of a presidential candidate that would avoid this kind of crisis that they might go into with Phala. I'm thinking the only other option is that they try to kind of suppress this. And they've done quite well to sweep Phala under the carpet so far. But I just don't know if it's possible for an entire presidential term. It's funny because in Nkandla, it was the exact same situation. Nkandla happened in Zuma's first term. They were able to kind of suppress and dance around it, but in the second term, it just reached a crisis, partly at the Constitutional Court, where it was impossible to escape. Consider the scenario: what if the Constitutional Court rules with the EFF and says, Parliament, that whole attempt to defend President Ramaphosa was constitutionally invalid. You have to investigate him. He has to resign, I'm afraid. Best for him is resign the day after that judgment. So Phala looms, and it's something that these negotiators need to consider very carefully, because I think it's going to determine a lot of political futures. Okay, cool. Finally, I want to talk about this parliamentary sitting that's coming up and where we go from here, right? Because there are some doubts that linger over this sitting. The first is, will there be electoral litigation? Parties seem to be quite quiet. MK is quiet. They have cast aspersions over these electoral results. They have not accepted them. So will there be a court challenge to the electoral results? And if there's a court challenge, then we know that things might be postponed. Even if that challenge is ultimately unsuccessful, we're going to have to wait for the courts to actually consider the matter and write a judgment and rule on the matter. Right? So there's that possibility. Funnily enough, I think parties might be a bit happy with that, because it will give them more time to negotiate rather than this 2-week period. So I think the litigation question is one that you need to keep an eye on. Will there be litigation? Will there not? And if there is, will the court accept that application or reject it? And if they accept it, then how quickly can we get a judgment? That process could take a month, so now we're in late June already, or early July. Even if there's no litigation, there's also the question of disruption. Now, I've seen this idea that the MK would boycott the first sitting of Parliament, and that would threaten Section 46 of the Constitution, because Parliament wouldn't be fully constituted. For what it's worth, my position on that is that I don't think that that's constitutionally correct. I think Section 46 simply deals with the composition of Parliament. And it's fairly clear when you look at the Constitution as a whole that people become, quote, elected members of Parliament before they're sworn in. The swearing in is a process by which they are then able to execute their functions as members, but it doesn't actually make them members. For example, when you look at Schedule 2 of the Constitution, it's clear there that, and Schedule 2 deals with the oath of office. So when people get sworn in, it already calls them members. So it says members of Parliament will get sworn in. That implies that they're already members before they get sworn in. And once they're sworn in, they're then able to perform the functions. Otherwise, what's being sworn in if not a member? So I think I agree. I need to look more closely into the constitutional question, and I probably will do in future episodes if this becomes relevant. But I don't think an MK boycott would result in an unconstituted parliament. I think all we would have is that 58 MPs would not be sworn in, but the size of parliament would still be 400 members. And that would actually aid the ANC, which is one thing that the MK needs to be careful of. If they don't go to parliament, then the majority necessary to elect a president becomes 58 seats less. So the ANC will be very able to elect whatever president they choose. But that's not the only form of disruption you can expect, I don't think, right? A boycott is not the only form. Remember what I said, 1/3 of parliament is now either the EFF or MK. Side note, the EFF and MK aren't the same thing. They're very different. But let's come back to the main story. So if the EFF plus MK is 1/3 of parliament roughly, or 25% or so, they can really disrupt that sitting if they choose to. And I'm afraid that's just the democratic outcome of where we are with this election, right? So 100 MPs roughly can make a big difference, more than 100 actually, like 110 or so. We know MK is not a big fan of Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, right? He's the person who has to preside over the sitting. Does MK disrupt Zondo himself? It's going to be peak, people, because never mind Ramaphosa, they're not big fans of Zondo. So could there be some kind of disruption in parliament even if MK MPs do take their seats? Well, they're powerful enough to disrupt. Whether they choose to disrupt or not is another question, which will probably be answered by the coalition negotiations. So there's that. So that sitting, which we'll do a whole episode on when we get closer, is going to be a moment in which we all as South Africans realize just how different the political world that we live in has become. Okay, well, I hope that helped you understand where we are in these coalition negotiations. I will continue to make these episodes that will guide all of us through, hopefully tame some of our fear and anxiety. South Africa will survive this. South Africa has survived a lot. It's going to be bumpy, it's going to be noisy, but don't listen to anyone who tells you that we can't make it through these next 5 years. If anything, there's as much hope as there should be fear. And I think we are in a new age of at least accountability. But whether it's an age of prosperity and justice remains to be seen. Like, share, subscribe. If you're listening on a podcast, give us a podcast rating and make sure that you keep it locked on SMWX. Share this with your aunt. Share this with your grandfather. Share this with your son or your daughter. Let's keep spreading the fire, which means spreading this channel via word of mouth to all the people that you know. Thank you for watching, and it's always great to have you back on this channel, SMWX fam. I see you, I recognize you, and I thank you. Ayeye.